So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this yesterday. Welcome to the Alden House Historic Site, a property owned and operated by the Alden Kindred of America. And if you picture, if you will, not this side of the house, this side of the barn, but this section right here is roughly 10.5 by 38 feet. The site of the original John and Priscilla Alden home site in Duxbury, where they raised their 10 children and created this farm beginning in about 1630. So here we are still on this site at the current Alden home that was built by their descendants. We welcome you here today. We're so thrilled to have Michelle here to give this fascinating presentation. When I first came here, I wasn't sure how in the world one would really look at a 17th century woman with not too many documents. And I think Michelle is able to do that so well and so vividly. And we can't wait to see what the Alden's neighbors, the Winslows, were up to. So without further ado, I also want to just encourage you to help yourself to refreshments afterwards. Michelle will be signing books. They will make a lovely holiday gift. Family and history buffs, so I encourage you to do that as well. So Michelle, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
And thanks to the Alden House and especially Desiree for having me here today. It's a real privilege to be here. So I study early American women because I feel that they continue to be significantly underrepresented in the telling of America's story. And if we're not hearing about the experiences of half the population and how they shaped this country, then we're really not getting the full picture of our history. So when I first heard about Penelope Winslow, I was amazed that I didn't know anything about her before because she was arguably one of the most influential women in Plymouth Colony's history. And Plymouth Colony, as you all know, founded in 1620 with the Pilgrims and lasted until 1692 when it was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay. And Penelope, as a member of the English gentry and the first lady of the colony, as wife to Governor Josiah Winslow, she wielded power and influence. And part of the reason that she's not better known is that until fairly recently, historians weren't studying women's history because women generally did not take part in the political process. It's only been really in the past few decades that historians have started to look at women's experiences. But also, Penelope didn't leave behind any writings that we know of, any significant writings. Unlike Michelle Marchetti, the subject of my first book, she didn't leave behind a juicy diary or letters. So it's been harder to approach her experiences. But she did leave behind a wealth of what is generally known as material culture. Basically anything made or used by people, the stuff. And in Penelope's case, these range from her portrait to surviving personal possessions, former homes that she lived in, and archaeological artifacts. And when we put together the material culture and the written records, we can really get a good idea of what her life was like. And also, it provides insights into the lives of other women and of just the development of New England as a whole. So I'm going to back up a bit and just give you a brief biography of Penelope's early years. She was born in 1633 in a small village about 70 miles outside of London called Bewers. And she, as I mentioned before, was a member of the English gentry. Her father, Herbert Pelham, was descended from several monarchs. And Penelope's third great-grandmother was Mary Boleyn. You may have heard her referred to as the other Boleyn girl who had the affair with King Henry VIII before her sister Anne got involved. On Penelope's mother's side, her mother was Jemima Waldegrave, and Jemima's family had been involved in British government for centuries. They were a very significant family. And over in America, Penelope was related to leading families of Massachusetts, to early governors of Virginia, and to the Baron de la Warr, after whom the colony of Delaware was named. And all of these connections, this family network, these networks were very important in early America, and they also gave Penelope a strong sense of identity, where she fit in the world. She had a sense of her own self-importance. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of where Penelope comes from. So this is Smallbridge Hall. This is the home of her maternal grandparents. This actually is now smaller than it used to be. It used to be a larger building. It's still very impressive, as you can see, with its moat. It entertained Queen Elizabeth I in the 1500s. And when my husband and I were fortunate enough to visit a few years ago, and Smallbridge was being renovated, as was Ferriers, which is Penelope's birthplace, which I'll show you in a minute. And it was great because it was really stripped of furniture, and you could see, really get an idea of what the house would have looked like during Penelope's lifetime. And so as I mentioned, Queen Elizabeth stayed at the house, so this is where she's supposed to have stayed. This room with a wonderful paneling. And this is Ferriers, so this is Penelope's house. And obviously this isn't as grand as Smallbridge Hall, but it definitely was a manor house. And it extends back, that you can't see, but it really is a large home. And living here would have given her, again, the sense of property and prestige. And we have this painting done as recently as 1962 by a pretty well-known British painter named John Nash. And I'm showing it because it shows Ferriers, you can see Ferriers in the middle of the painting, but you can see this land just extends for acres. And so, again, just this visual reminder of how much property the family owned reinforced her sense of independence. And I have a new clicker here. Just some early features, wonderful early features in Ferriers, original woodwork, and this wonderful courthouse. So this was built in the 1500s, and so it predates Penelope's residence there, but her father was a justice of the peace, and he may have used it himself. And I didn't mention that Ferriers was brought to the marriage by Penelope's mother, Jemima Waldegrave. So when Penelope is about 5 years old, her father he's a merchant adventurer investor in Massachusetts Bay. And he decides to take the family to emigrate to New England. So Penelope and her 4 siblings and her father go over. Unfortunately, her mother died on the voyage, either before the voyage or during the voyage, we're not sure. The family settles in Cambridge, and they're already wealthy to begin with, but Herbert Pelham acquires more land. He becomes very active in the government. He becomes Harvard's first treasurer, and he remarries soon afterwards. And the family's doing very well, but within a few years, Herbert needs to go back to England to tend to an estate issue. So the whole family goes back, with the exception of Nathaniel, Penelope's brother, who stays to attend Harvard, and Penelope herself. And she's 13 years old at the time, and we're unsure why she remained behind. Later indications are that she did not have the greatest relationship with her stepmother, but in any case, she probably then moved in with her paternal aunt, her father's sister, another Penelope, who's married to Richard Bellingham, who's a very significant person in Boston. He serves as governor for several terms. And the couple, Penelope and Richard, have this house in downtown Boston. It's unfortunately no longer there, but this mansion house located near King's Chapel. And this living there would have exposed Penelope to ideas and people that really broadened her world. And at some point, she meets Josiah Winslow. And we know that Penelope's father and Josiah's father, Edward Winslow, whom you all know as the Pilgrim, and himself, an early governor of Plymouth Colony, they were known to each other. But we think maybe Penelope and Josiah got to know each other through her brother Nathaniel. Josiah did attend Harvard, he didn't graduate. But in any case, we have Penelope and Josiah in London around 1651, because that's when they get their portraits painted. So here is the portrait of Josiah and his father. So the portraits of Josiah, his father, and Penelope are likely painted by the same artist, whose identity we don't know. Edward's is dated 1651, and he holds his letter in his hand that wonderfully is signed from your loving wife, Susanna. And his wife, Susanna, was Susanna White, originally Susanna White, who came over on the Mayflower, gave birth to Peregrine in Provincetown Harbor, and her husband died soon after, and Edward's wife died, and their marriage was the first in Plymouth Colony. But in any case, we have these portraits here, and at first glance they look like they're just, they look like they're portraits of Puritans or Pilgrims. And just briefly to differentiate, the Puritans and the Pilgrims were, the Puritans who settled Massachusetts Bay and the Pilgrims who settled Plymouth had many religious beliefs in common. Basically, the Pilgrims wanted to separate from the Church of England, and they were more radical than the Puritans, who just wanted to purify the church. But in any case, we have this stereotype as Pilgrims and Puritans dressing in sober black and very plain clothing and being killjoys and not interested in life's pleasures, and this really wasn't the case. And just to talk about their clothing for a minute, the reason they're dressed in black is because black is the most expensive dye, so it's a way to show their wealth. It's a very expensive fabric that they're wearing, and they have these starched white collars and these gold tassels, and then Edward has his gold buttons and his white linen cuffs. And so they're clearly very interested in portraying their wealth and their prestige in the portraits. Around the time that they were painted, 1651, England is just finishing up the Civil War. And so the Puritans and Pilgrims of New England would have been supporters of the Puritan Oliver Cromwell and his forces. And they would have opposed the Royalist forces led by King Charles I and his son, King Charles II. And yet, I thought it was fascinating to see that in her portrait, Penelope is dressed very similarly to the wife and the daughter of King Charles I. Mm-hmm. So we can see, to the far right is Queen Henrietta Maria, King Charles I's wife. And meanwhile, King Charles I was beheaded in 1649. So he was no longer with us when Penelope's portrait was painted. But the colors that Penelope's wearing are very similar to the ones worn by Queen Henrietta Maria. And then Princess Mary Stuart, you can see the hairstyle, the choker necklace, this little hood that they're both wearing, again, very similar. Penelope has her hair in this long, curly style like Princess Mary. And also I want to point out that Josiah has his hair styled. He has these long locks as well, which is more associated with the Cavaliers who were supporters of the Royalist forces, of King Charles I and II. So again, she's presenting herself as a very elite individual, that she's dressed so nicely, and she had her portrait painted in Boston around this time. There are very few portraits of 17th century women painted in New England, but those that do survive, they're more modestly dressed. The wealthy people are showing off their wealth by fine clothing, but they're more modest. Her hair is uncovered. Her shoulders are showing. This is unusual. So it's a little bit rebellious. You kind of wonder if she was back in Boston with her aunt and uncle looking over her shoulder when she picked that outfit. So just kind of, you can really spend a lot of time thinking about the portrait. But in any case, so the portraits were, and in clothing at this time, I do want to mention, it was extremely important in society in general, and in fact there were sumptuary laws that prohibited, both in England and New England, that prohibited dressing above your class, your station in life. So the portraits of Penelope and Josiah and Edward are sent back to Marshfield, and that is where Penelope and Josiah returned to Marshfield as well. And they're displayed in the family homes, and they're really markers to any guests who come as to how important the owners are, because portraits are so rare at this time period. And the portraits are sent through the families, and then in the 1880s they're given to Pilgrim Hall Museum. And Pilgrim Hall has a number of, as you may well know, a number of Winslow family possessions, a number of which are purported to be Penelope's. And the most iconic of these is this shoe. So this was formerly, it was formerly a salmon pink color. It has this very elaborate silver lace on it. And the tale has been that this was Penelope's wedding shoe, wedding slipper. She wore it at the time of her wedding. And there's one other shoe that became separated from this one. Back in the 1800s, the two shoes descended through the families of two brothers. And the owner of the other shoe only became aware of this one's existence in the 1990s. And so this caused this big stir, and both of the shoes were displayed together at Pilgrim Hall in an exhibit, which is very exciting. But unfortunately, the story about the shoes has really shifted dramatically recently with the discovery that they were actually a man's shoes. So they weren't Penelope's wedding slippers. So when I first started studying Penelope, Stephen O'Neill, who worked on the exhibit here, was then curator at Pilgrim Hall Museum, and he mentioned to me that a British footwear historian had visited the museum. She happened to comment that she thought that the shoe was a man's shoe, not a woman's shoe. So I said, well, I can't let that go. You know, I need to follow up on that. And so I did follow up with several footwear historians who all confirmed it was probably a man's fancy indoor slipper. So it's probably just like a slipper that he wore around the house, not Penelope's wedding shoe. And this has actually caused great consternation among some staff members at Pilgrim Hall Museum. It's disappointed. And then we have, coincidentally, displayed near the wedding slipper is Josiah's, on the right, Josiah's baby shoes right there, Pilgrim Hall. And then this is just another pair. These are they were formerly salmon pink as well. Men's slippers from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Obviously not as fancy, but just to show that they were these types of shoes were widely worn by upper class men during that time period. So Pilgrim Hall has a number of possessions that some of them are not on display that belong to Penelope. Just a couple more to point out are this beaded bag here. So it's small. It's actually about 4 inches by 4 inches. The story that came down with it is that she beaded it while on a sea voyage, which is very romantic, and perhaps it's true. We don't know. It does date from the first half of the 1600s, so the time period is right. These bags were popular then, and they were made by women as gifts often for other women or for men. So Penelope may have made it as a little gift for Josiah. And then this item right here, this is a very personal object. So this is what's called a bodkin. It's a blunt ended needle. It has holes at either end. It's silver and has the initials PW on it. It did descend through the family, and so it's very likely this was Penelope's. But this is something that really links her to other women, because many women had bodkins. They were used to, with all the laces involved in lacing up clothing at that time. Many women had bodkins. Most of them weren't silver. But in any case, it connects her to other women, and it also made me think of Penelope as a mother, because women at that time were not wearing maternity clothes. They were just let in and take out their clothing during pregnancies. So Penelope, unfortunately, did not. She had some tough luck having children. She lost a few children young. She did have 2 surviving children, a daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1664, and a son, Isaac, born in 1671. And this is a really small family because, as you may well know, Plymouth Colony had these huge families that the first generation had about 7 kids, the second generation had 8 kids, the third generation had an average of 9 kids, and of course we know the Aldens had so many children. So they weren't alone. So the personal possessions that have survived give a real sense of Penelope as an individual and as a physical person. And then material culture related to the homes in which she lived really helped round out the story. And so, as I mentioned, after Penelope married Josiah, they moved to Marshfield. That must have been quite a shock to her, because after living in Boston and Cambridge, which were hubs of New England at that time, and then going to London, and then coming to quiet Marshfield, she must have had an adjustment period to deal with that. But Edward Winslow never returned to he never returned to Marshfield. So he died in 1655. He was in London for many years on New England business. And so Josiah inherited the estate. Originally, they would have lived with Susanna White Winslow, but at some point they built their own house. We're not exactly sure of the date. And I want to talk to you for a minute about houses during that time period. They weren't private, just private domestic spaces like they are today. So during this time, men aren't leaving to go to the office, right? They're conducting their businesses from home. And so women were very keyed into what their husbands' businesses were. And in fact, there's a term, deputy husband, where which implies how a woman would have been very familiar with her husband's business dealings, and that when her husband was unable, when he was away or unable to take care of his business, the wife would have been seen by other men as a perfectly normal stand-in, because there was this realization and acknowledgement of how much women were involved in their husbands' businesses. So this would have been taken a step further in the Winslow house, because from his earliest days after his marriage, Josiah was deeply involved in Plymouth government until he became the governor in 1673. So he served on the general court, he was a military leader, and Penelope would have been very conversant with all of these things going on in his life. He also had a wide range of commercial experiences, commercial involvement. So just think of her, how she's wielding power. So people, especially after Josiah became governor, people are coming to the house because they want to talk to him. They were seeking favors. He's away from home a lot of times, so Penelope is a gatekeeper. And people realize that she can mediate the messages that people want to give to Josiah. And also just thinking of other women coming to see her on behalf of their own husbands, what their own husbands want, favors from Josiah, etc. So there are all these networks of women that we never hear about, but they're very involved on an informal level with what's going on in Plymouth Colony. And one other little piece of evidence I just want to mention, because it ties into the Alden house, is you can see when you look at the deeds from Plymouth Colony how women are often witnesses to different deeds. And so there's a deed signed, witnessed by Penelope and Sarah Alden Standish, so John and Priscilla's daughter, who's married to the son of Miles and Barbara Standish. And so this deed, on the face of it, it looks pretty dull. It has to do with the maintenance of a bridge over the North River. But it's actually a really important piece of infrastructural business, because this bridge is connecting people from Plymouth to Boston. And women, again, on an informal basis, but they're involved in this transaction as they witnessed this deed. And there's lots of examples of deeds like that in the records. So we're lucky because there are several archaeological excavations have been conducted at Penelope and Josiah's home, beginning in 1940 with one conducted by Henry Hornblower, who founded Plymouth Plantation. And recently, or in recent decades, Hornblower's excavation was reevaluated by some scholars, including Karen Goldstein, who you may have heard of. She was a leading scholar of Plymouth history. She wrote an article with Mary Beaudry and Craig Chartier, who are archaeologists in the area, and they, based on newer technological, newer advances in interpreting house structures and dating artifacts, what they found out that what Henry Hornblower in 1940 thought was Edward and Susanna's home site was actually very likely Penelope and Josiah's, because and the artifacts date to the later half of the 1600s. So they came up with this house plan, and you can see this would have, for the time, this would have been a substantially sized house. They have this, one thing I like is this porch feature, which is something that was favored by the English gentry and the New England gentry in the late 1500s, early 1600s. So again, with their house, they're expressing their importance to the world. During that time, too, I showed you the house had a hall. That's the big room where daily activity would have taken place, and the more formal parlor where entertaining and business would have taken place. And then this just shows the upper floor. this having the archaeology and the artifacts is also complemented by the survival of Josiah's household inventory. So after he died in 1680, an inventory was taken and listing possessions in the home. And the appraisers named the hall chamber as containing the widow's bed. So this is the biggest bedroom and suitably lived in by Penelope and Josiah. These are just this great chair at Pelham Museum. You can see, just kind of imagine Josiah holding court, sitting in his great chair. And this is a plate, it's an imported Delft plate that's at Pilgrim Hall. And this demonstrates how the Winslows, not just the Winslows, but their neighbors, the Plymouth colony, was connected to the wider world. There's a perception, a lasting perception that Plymouth colony was very insular and kind of backwards. And it's not the case because there was all kinds of trade going on, and so there were all kinds of imports. You can see that in these imports that are coming into people's homes. Also here, of course, is the famous peregrine white cradle that Susanna White Winslow is supposed to have brought over from Holland for peregrine. And that descended through the family may have been used by Penelope for her own children. Now, here's the archaeology is very exciting to me because it really helps round out the, as I said, the picture that we obtained through the personal possessions. So thinking about Penelope being concerned with clothing and appearance and perhaps being a good needlewoman or an expert needlewoman if she made that little bag, we see in the far upper corner there, Plymouth Plantation has thousands of Winslow artifacts. And so among them is this wonderful little needle case that actually still contains needles. And then the scissors, so lots of scissor fragments. These are found all over the place because every woman is using scissors. They're doing some type of sewing. And this item in the middle is really connected to Penelope and Josiah's taste for fine clothing. And I was asked by the curator at Pilgrim Hall if I could identify it. I had no idea. Does anyone happen to know what it is? Okay, it's called a goffring, and it's actually used specifically to iron ruffles. So it's for people who have high status. Now, we have a little knife over here, and there are lots of knives and spoons found in the site. No forks, because people weren't using forks in New England at the time. But David Landon, another archaeologist, has actually interpreted the findings of the animal bones that are found on the Winslow property, and through that has been able to give us insight into their eating habits. So we find out that the Winslows were good English people, that they liked their beef. They ate a lot of beef. And this is, other items give insight into other aspects of Penelope and her family's life. So this is a silver whistle with the initials EW. Perhaps it belonged to their daughter Elizabeth, her and Josiah's daughter Elizabeth. And then a marble, which is just great items. And very importantly, what we find on all of these sites in Plymouth Colony that have been excavated is lots of native-made items. And some of these are separate. They predate the colonial artifacts, but others are intermingled with the colonial artifacts. And this just shows is a representation of the native colonial exchange that's going on. So, in other words. So I'll explain what these items are and then talk a little more about it. But these random little bits of metal up here, they were taken from brass and copper kettles that were traded with the natives. They were used as trade items, but the natives would break them down and use the pieces of metal for their own purposes. They would make jewelry or projectile points with them. And then over here we have this great spoon found on the Winslow site. And you can see with the pattern of wear on the left-hand side that the owner had been right-handed, which is great. It's like the past speaking to you over hundreds of years. But then these two items up here are spoon stems missing the, So this these spoon stems. So they were taken by a native person and filed down to a point to be used for a tool. So there's all kinds of this. And then we know that women like Penelope and Priscilla were likely cooking on native pots, whatever item suited a particular purpose. So there's lots of this cross-cultural exchange of knowledge and technology going both ways. So this also is a good segue to talking about King Philip's War. So this is the defining moment of Josiah's governorship. So he becomes governor in 1673. King Philip's War breaks out in 1675, lasts through the following year. It is, to date, it remains the deadliest war in American history per capita. Because the population was so small, the number of deaths, in proportion to the population, give it that place in history. So we know that Josiah's father, Edward, had this fabled relationship with Massasoit, and they had a friendship. We have the story about Edward going to nurse him when he's ill. And Edward had a real curiosity about native culture and language and ways. Josiah didn't have that curiosity, and he wasn't a diplomat like his father was. But also, by the second generation, there are more and more people coming into Plymouth Colony, and they're really stressing the natives because they're just crimming them out of their own lands. It's just really exacerbating these tensions that are already there, these cultural tensions. And also there is the belief among many settlers here that they're here to Christianize the natives. So, as I said, there are all sorts of tensions. And there are two pivotal events that historians often point to as leading directly to the outbreak of King Philip's War. And Penelope, remarkably, was present for both of those occasions, and this really hasn't been discussed before. But one occurred in 1662, so it's before Josiah is governor. And by this time, Massasoit is dead. He has two sons, Wamsutta, who's known by the settlers, his English name is Alexander, and then Metacom, who's known by the settlers as Philip. And to simplify things, I'm just going to call them Alexander and Philip, because Wamsutta has a wife, Witamu, that's a little bit similar, and she actually is a sachem in her own right. She's a very powerful person. Alexander is accused by the Plymouth government of selling land according to the terms of a treaty and of conspiring with the Narragansetts against the settlers. So Josiah, as a military leader, is sent to go to get Wamsutta, or Alexander, and bring him back to Plymouth to answer these charges. And so Alexander is with his wife, Witamu, who I mentioned, and also with several other family members. He agrees to accompany Josiah, but on the way they stop at Josiah and Penelope's home because they're going to spend the night there before going to Plymouth. And so it's just fascinating to me to kind of imagine that Penelope is used to giving hospitality to different dignitaries or prominent people in the Plymouth government. And so I hope she treated her native guests with the same courtesy that she treated her other important guests. But also thinking about Penelope interacting with Witamu, who I mentioned was a sachem in her own right. She has diplomatic powers. She's recognized as a power in her tribe. And so in the scheme of things, Witamu would have actually outranked Penelope. But Penelope probably wouldn't have recognized that. But it's just really interesting to think about that and explore that interaction a little bit. So unfortunately, the visit does not end well because Alexander becomes ill. And Josiah sends for the doctor. The doctor is not able to heal Alexander. It's decided that he will return home and heal and then come back to Plymouth to answer these charges. And unfortunately, he dies soon after returning home. And Witamu, his wife, and his brother Philip believe that he's been poisoned. And they believe that Josiah or the doctor may have had something to do with it. And yes, so fast forward 12 years to 1674, Josiah is governor, and he receives a visit from a native man named John Sassaman. John Sassaman is a Harvard-educated Christian minister, and he comes to Josiah and Penelope's home to warn them of an impending attack by Philip. And so again, you can imagine Penelope being home. Perhaps she let John Sassaman in. she certainly would have discussed the nature of his visit at some point after he left. He warns Josiah, and he says he fears for his life if news gets out to Philip that he's forwarding this warning. Josiah unfortunately doesn't believe him because he's received similar warnings that haven't come to him. So John Sassaman leaves the house and then disappears, and his body is found a few weeks later. And so it's presumed that he's been murdered and by agents of Philip. And so 3 native men are arrested and tried and convicted and executed. And then Philip attacks soon afterwards. So the war breaks out. There are all these terrible attacks going on locally. Josiah, as the governor, he's the governor of Plymouth Colony, which is the colony embroiled in the war at first, alone. And he's also the head of the military forces. So he takes a very prominent role in this. But one of his first instincts is to protect his family because he knows that Philip has this, believes that he had a role in his brother's death. So he arranges for Penelope and their children, Elizabeth, who's 11 at the time, and Isaac is 4, to go stay with his sister, Elizabeth, up in Salem. And her husband, she's married to a wealthy merchant named George Corman. And so Penelope, like many people on both sides of the war, becomes a war refugee. And we know from later events that she had a difficult time with this, from being separated from Josiah, from her home. There was a lot of worry associated and anxiety because she doesn't know what's going to happen. So Josiah writes this letter noting that he's sending his family away, and he says, I am stockading my house, and I have soldiers on guard and will remain here as long as a man will stand by me. It's this very dramatic letter. And what's really cool is that the archaeology really rounds out this story in that the archaeologists found post holes in the ground showing that there had been a defensive stockade built around the house. There are pipe stems dating from this period that speak to the presence of these soldiers on duty. And there are also other things like gun fragments. So down here we have some bullets and parts of guns. And then we have this high style, very fancy horse furniture, so bridles and bits of bridles, bits and stirrups, etc., buckles, and all of that. So it just really gives an immediacy and an impact to the story provided by these written records. So the war ends in 1676. Of course, it had been very hard on Plymouth Colony. It takes the colony years to recover. Obviously, it has a devastating effect on the native peoples who lose their lands, separated from their families, in many cases sold into slavery. But Penelope returns home, and one of her goals is to help Josiah restore his reputation with King Charles II. So the monarchy has been restored in 1660 in England. King Charles II is on the throne, and he wants to know how did colonial native relations deteriorate to the point where a war broke out. So Josiah writes this letter, this detailed letter explaining everything to King Charles II. He also arranges for this war prize. It's King Philip's military regalia, which includes different pieces by these 2 supposedly fabulous wampum belts. And here's a picture of, this is not an accurate representation, this was actually done 100 years later by Paul Revere, this engraving, but it shows this wampum belt around King Philip's waist. So they arranged to send the letter and these prizes to Penelope's brother, Waldegrave. Her father has died, her brother Waldegrave has inherited the family house Ferriers. And they said, Waldegrave, you need to bring these to court, get these to the king. And so Waldegrave defaults on the mission, and they never wind up there. And so it's this enduring mystery to this day, what happened to the wampum belts? And actually, when my husband and I were at Ferriers, the owners of the house know about the wampum belts, and the house was under construction if there are no wampum belts. Waldegrave may have hidden them somewhere, but they're not at Ferriers. But actually, the Wampanoag scholar Paula Peters, whom you may know, she is actually researching it a bit further, so maybe she'll come up with some additional information. So the war has taken a terrible toll on Josiah's health, and for years after it ends, he dies. And we know Penelope has a terrible time with his passing. There is a really wonderful letter that survives from Plymouth Colony Secretary Nathaniel Morton to her, trying to console her for this loss. And she is supposed to have had this mourning ring commemorated, she commissions this mourning ring to commemorate Josiah's passing by a well-known Boston gold and silversmith named John Coney. His mark is in the ring. It's this very high-style ring that is supposed to, you can see this hair through the ring. It's supposed to be Josiah's hair. This descended through the family and is at Pilgrim Hall. It doesn't have, unfortunately, it doesn't have Josiah's initials or a date, so we can't be 100% sure that Penelope did, that she did commission this, but there's a strong possibility that she did. So after Josiah dies, she's a widow for the final 23 years of her life. And she oversees the property. So at this time when, typically when a husband dies and leaves a will, he leaves his wife, you may have heard of the term a widow's thirds. So it was by law, common law, that a widow would get a third of her husband's personal property and a third life interest in his real estate. But Josiah leaves everything to Penelope, basically. He leaves her broad jurisdiction, broad powers over the disposal of the property, because he clearly trusts her judgment, because she had clearly had experience overseeing the estate during his lifetime when he was traveling on business. And Penelope, during this time, also, she's overseeing the estate, she raises and educates her children, and she also, very interestingly, becomes involved in these two legal battles to reclaim family inheritances. And I'm not going to go into them too much, but one has to do with Waldegrave, her brother. As I said, her father has died. Waldegrave is the executor of her father's estate, and she finds out that her grandfather, her maternal grandfather, had left her a large sum of money that she never received. And so she writes this legal document that has survived. It's really fascinating to hear her voice in this document. And then fast forward to 1703, the year she dies, and right before she dies, she files another grievance against her half-brother, Edward. So Edward is the son of her father and his second wife. And Edward is claiming property here in Massachusetts that rightly belongs to Penelope. So even though real estate descends through the male line, she realizes and recognizes her right to this particular property, and she has no qualms about going after it. So, just it testifies to the very strong person she was, very strong character. So this is, as you know, probably everyone knows this house, the Isaac Winslow house in Marshfield, built circa 1699. And we're not sure what happened to Edward and Susanna's house, Penelope and Josiah's house. They may have burned down, we're not sure. We know they were gone by 1726 because Isaac writes in the deed, he mentions the site where the old house stood. So there's a possibility Penelope lived her final years in this house, but we don't know. And then I'm going to show you one final material object related to Penelope's history, and that's this commemorative stone that was placed in the 20th century on the location of her former home. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Winslow House in Marshfield. If you cross the street and go down this dirt path, there is this place in the woods where the two houses were supposed to have stood, and there's this marker. And the marker just mentions that the home site formerly belonged to Governors Edward and Josiah. There's no mention of Susanna, there's no mention of Penelope, and it just is really a real literal example of how women's history has been covered up over the years. So after Penelope dies, she continues to be revered by her descendants, who they name their children Pelham, after that's her family name, and Penelope. There are still Penelopes today, and they preserve the family belongings and the stories associated with them, even though some errors crept in, along the way through the generations. A number of her descendants remain loyalists during the American Revolution, And I think this can partly be attributed to the strong sense of identity and connection they feel to their British lineage. You know, with her portrait there, I think the portrait is the key, that survives. They have this visual representation of their connection to, as I said, they're descended from monarchs, British monarchs, and also just their status in society is really linked to this traditional lifestyle that they've had. So then, she's largely forgotten, except, as I said, for the mostly female relatives who have preserved her heritage and the family heirlooms. And this is really common for women in families to take care of these personal family stories and belongings, but also larger pieces of the historical record. And in conclusion, I just want to say that I really think that the combining of this material culture, these material sources with traditional written records is one way to get at the story of not just an elite person like Penelope, but more ordinary people. And I think there are so many more important but hidden stories out there of people who made an impact on their time, and it's really up to us to find ways to get to these stories. So I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
So since my name is Alexander, I'm interested in Wamsutta. And how did that naming take place? Was it purely arbitrary, or were there some?
No, I can't get into the details of it because I don't know, but I know that that Wamsutta and Metacom agreed to take those names. They did agree to take those names, and I don't know. I think it's easy enough to find out. These are very prominent figures in Wampanoag history, so it would be pretty easy to find out more about them.
I grew up in Simsbury, Connecticut, and we always talk about King Philip's War there, so I imagine it carried on from not just here in Massachusetts.
Right.
Okay.
So it spread, and then it developed into other wars. You know, it's just it spread into Massachusetts, and then we have King William's War, Queen Anne's War. You know, they just unfortunately they just go on and on and on.
There's a King Philip's cave that we always used to hike to, where the rumor was he would sit in there while he watched all his, everything get destroyed and burned below. So.
Yeah, there are some really good recent books on King Philip's War from a native perspective. One is Memory Lands by Christine DeLucia, and another is by Lisa Brooks, and it is called Our Beloved Kin, and it talks about women, Native women in particular. And these are they're both award-winning books, and they're very recent, I think 2018.
Are you familiar with the story of Hannah Parsons? She came from Marshfield, her family did, and her father started a farm out at the end of Gurnet, out of Gurnet Point. And she didn't marry for quite a while, but she did finally marry a Parsons, and he was an officer in the Revolutionary War and was up in the New York, Canadian area and caught some disease and died. And she had been running, they had 20 lights at the top of their roof of their house, one at each end. She managed all of that during the Revolutionary War. And then, after he died and the war was over, then the Commonwealth of Massachusetts decided that they would appoint a new lighthouse keeper. Yes, and they didn't appoint him. So she petitioned.
Good for her. She filed her paperwork.
I knew you loved the story. And so she petitioned to be the lighthouse keeper and won, and she got them to pay her extra because the soldiers who'd been stationed there during the war had created some damage to her property. Because Mr. Parsons had left everything to her again. And so she got the legislature or the colonial government, now the U.S. government, to pay her for the damages. And she continued keeping the light for a long time.
Wonderful.
Yes, it was marvelous. And we recently, I'm on the board of Project Gurnet Bug Light, and we recently had a celebration over at the church not in Kingston, where there was some connection with Hannah to that church. And so we had a celebration of her life, and there's a lovely marker there.
That's
So
great.
she was a wonderful colonial woman.
Good for her.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you for sharing that.
Going back another 100 years to another woman, in the died 1673, Mayflower related, a Warren, Richard Warren's wife Elizabeth.
Sure.
You're probably familiar with how much is being uncovered about Elizabeth Warren, and how she was the only woman in Plymouth Colony to own her own land, and they've learned that it went all the way to Standish, to Sandwich. And I did write, as I mentioned to you, about 16 women in history over 4 centuries. Elizabeth Warren is number 2 of those 16. And I'm wondering if, she died in 1673. She has a grandson, I think it is, who married Penelope Winslow's granddaughter, Penelope Winslow, James Warren. If Penelope's sense of entitlement to write that second letter about Edward Winslow's trying to take land that was hers, might tie in any way with, she should have known Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren was taken to court by her son twice. He was trying to get the land away from his mother, and each time Bradford said, no, it's hers, and we're gonna leave it that way.
Yeah, it was a small world back then, right? They knew,
must have known.
exactly, right. Their paths crossed for sure. But it would be fun to know, more details, like actually have some actual proof, right?
It would be
Yeah.
fun.
Where is Priscilla buried, I guess?
Oh, Penelope?
Or Penelope,
Yeah, so
sorry.
she is in, this is another she's in the Winslow Cemetery, down the street from
Yes.
the Winslow house in Marshfield.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so they're all there, Josiah, Edward, Susanna, and Penelope. There's
Oh,
one,
okay.
one tombstone.
Okay.
Yes, so that's where she is.
Ah, thank you.
You want to remember that when the Pilgrims came and when the people were talking about the living, this was all woodland. There was no farmland here.
Well, actually, there's a good article that Desiree and I were talking about, and it's about archaeology done here. And actually, the Alden settled here because it had been cleared by Wampanoag people.
Earlier, yeah.
So
Oh,
it is
yeah.
interesting that
Yeah.
some of these sites have been cleared by
Yeah. The
native
natives,
people.
yeah.
Yeah. But for sure, it was an arduous, just settling and building houses.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the difficulties that people went through.
Yeah, the Winslows are often associated with being royalists right through the Revolution. Do you know if there were any breaks within the Winslow family?
Yeah,
like
so
the civil-
it's interesting because the people, so Edward Winslow's brothers, they weren't as financially successful as Josiah, and so they were patriots. Their families were patriots, tended to be patriots, and so it was really just the Edward Winslow branch.
that stayed.
Yeah. That's interesting.
I'm just wondering how Penelope was educated.
Oh, I didn't mention that, sorry. Yes, we don't know for sure. She likely was, she definitely had some education. And at this time, because of the Puritans and the Pilgrims' belief that reading the Bible was extremely important. And so everyone should be taught to read so they could read the Bible. So there's a very high literacy rate here in early New England. Not all women could write because that's looked upon more as a professional skill necessary for men to conduct business, so not really necessary for women to have. So, but she is a good writer. So she probably may have had a private tutor. Her aunt Penelope probably educated her. So a variety of methods, but there were women teaching school in Plymouth from early on. I mean, obviously Penelope wasn't here in Plymouth for her education, but I know, so I worked on, if you haven't seen the women exhibit at Pilgrim Hall, it's really great. I worked on that, but I'm only saying it's great because Donna Curtin, who's the mastermind of it, and she did a fabulous job with these films and artifacts. But, so I worked on literacy, Plymouth women in literacy for that, and found evidence from really the earliest years that there were schools kept by women in Plymouth.
I have to take a deep breath before I ask this question, because you've given such a wonderful historical speech, and I have such a simple question, but inquiring minds want to know. Why would a woman have carried a purse around back then? What would she have kept in it?
Oh, all kinds of little things, her little, just like women carry them now. I think that first contents haven't changed. Yeah, so, she would have carried her money, and of course, this is just her money, and, she made, actually, there was a comb back there that I could bring up again, but it's interesting, it's a double-sided comb that was found in the archaeology, in the digs. And they actually found a similar one in an excavation in Boston, a well-known excavation, the Catherine Nanny Naylor site in the North End. And what's interesting about it is it's a double-sided comb, one with really teeth that are very close together, and one that are with teeth that are regularly spaced apart. And so there's the side that you comb your hair with, but then the other side, I'm not saying this is what she carried in her purse, I want a total sidebar, but was used for picking up lice. So, I'm not saying that's what she carried in her purse, but yeah, women, it's the same thing. And women did, she may have used some kind of cosmetics because of her background, I don't know, probably not, but she could have, because elite women in England were using them. But yeah, just her money and her keys, because she probably has keys to storage units around the house, and not in that one because that's too nice to really bring around the house, but yeah, there were all kinds of little things she could have put in her purse. Her handkerchief? Yeah, and all kinds of little things.
Scissors.
So, yeah, scissors. So I'm happy to talk with anyone else afterwards, but thank you very much. I appreciate your